Welcome everyone to the sixth in the series of lectures to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of the Institute of Applied Linguistics, University of Warsaw. Our speaker today is Professor Tony McEnery, whom I will introduce in a moment, but Professor McEnery has asked me to let him speak before I speak, so the floor is yours.
Okay. In that case, there's probably a factual error in what I'm about to say, but for those of you who don't speak Polish, I'm about to speak it perfectly. And for those of you that do, I apologize for the violence I'm about to do your language. Okay, so mam zaszczyt być pierwszym prelegentem tej serii wykładów z okazji 50-lecia lingwistyki stosowanej na Uniwersytecie Warszawskim. Najlepsze życzenia na następne 50 lat.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. I understood, so I think everyone else has understood. Well done. Thank you so much. Shall I introduce you in Polish or then in English?
That's the end of the Polish from me, I'm afraid. So maybe let's stick to English, but I hope you appreciate the gesture.
Thank you very much. Just for those who have joined us and will feel more comfortable with Polish, I want to remind you that this lecture is being translated into Polish, but two excellent interpreters, our students. And in order to listen to the translation, you have to switch to the Polish channel, which down on the screen is this icon of the globe. And this is where you can switch to the Polish channel. And now, without the formal ado, let me introduce our speaker. And it is, in fact, my great honor and a self-afflicted privilege to introduce to you Professor Tony McEnery, who is a distinguished professor of English language and linguistics at Lancaster University. And when introducing the speaker, the person introducing tries to say something original, but I'm afraid that in the case of our guest, I have to use the well-tried cliche. Our guest today doesn't really need an introduction. so this is and I couldn't escape this cliche because I believe that everyone, particularly everyone who has anything to do with corpus linguistics, knows Professor Tony McEnery, who has done a lot of research using corpus methods in a whole range of different areas, ranging from theoretical linguistics to applied linguistics. And that's why, among other things, he is very known among the wide community of corpus linguists. Professor Tony McEnery is a member of many different research groups, but just at Lancaster University, he's the member of Center for Corpus Approaches for Social Science, and another research group, which we all know very well due to the tools it produces, University Center for Computer Corpus Research on Language. And he's also involved in a range of projects and activities ranging from building a learner corpus, Trinity Lancaster corpus, or working on the new version of the British National Corpus, but also much more specific projects like improving patient experience, textual analysis of National Cancer Patient Survey, or on the other hand, understanding corporate communication. This is a less recent project. And Professor McEnery is also an author of many publications, volumes, but also articles published in journals. And I think all of us have learned from the course books he co-authored, and I try to find them all, and I'm afraid that I missed a few, but corpus linguistics method, theory and practice, corpus-based language studies, and much more recently, fundamental principles of corpus linguistics. So the course books or the textbooks that all of us use when we take first steps in corpus linguistics. But at the same time, Professor McEnery is a very active researcher in, again, a variety of fields. And just to name to his most recent publications. One is on keywords through time, which is tracking changes in press discourse of Islam, published this year in International Journal of Corpus Linguistics. And I've picked among many, but I was very intrigued by the title, a chapter in a book on corpus pragmatic studies on the history of medical discourse. That's a chapter on geography of names, a genre analysis of nationality-driven names of venereal diseases in the 17th century England. And I think it sums it all. It sums how widely Professor McEnery has published on a really number of topics. And I think I'll stop here, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So how long do I have, Agnieszka, just to make sure
about,
that I get this
about
right?
An hour.
About an hour, that's fine. Okay, well, let me start the slideshow. Get this right. And then do the share screen thing. That one. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. In that case, I think I'd better start. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this talk. Today, I'll be talking to you about discourse, language learning, and learner corpora. Throughout, I'll be giving you references to papers where you can go away and find out more about what I'm talking about. Because although Agnieszka has very kindly pointed out how I publish very widely, sometimes those papers come actually as a set of papers. And today I'll be talking you through a range of projects and showing you how they built up to a bigger whole, so to speak. So I'll reference the individual papers. I put tiny URLs there. If they don't work, I've actually given the full reference of the paper too. And this work, I should emphasize, is work I've done jointly with Izzy Clark and Gavin Brooks. And also, I was very kindly provided with a fellowship by the Leverhulme Trust for quite a lot of this work. So the logo is up there with all the others. Okay. Okay. So I start from the premise that the promise of learner corpora in some ways is yet to be met. They're undoubtedly very influential and they're undoubtedly very useful. But I think they've yet to reach the full range of uses they could be put to, and we've yet to see the full depth of the analyses that we can do with them. So we're making good progress, but more work to do. And to get an idea of that argument, you can have a look at this paper in the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics. There's an interaction with second language acquisition theory, which is in principle important, but still to date it's somewhat unsatisfactory. There's more that could be done. That's certainly argued in this paper. But in particular, and this is a point made in that paper, but which actually a main theme today, its engagement with conversational interaction and areas of pragmatics in particular has been fleeting and shallow, though this is improving. In part, of course, that's because a lot of data that we have is written, so we're not seeing this sort of dialogic interaction. And then a lot of the spoken data itself isn't necessarily controlled by task, isn't necessarily spontaneous conversation, for example. This leads to various problems. So, for example, in terms of variable control, we can engage with issues in learner corpora. What do I mean by that? Well, it's very often the case in SLA research, for example, that people are looking at specific configurations of variables when they're undertaking experiments. So they have a theory and the theory makes a prediction about people of a certain gender, educational background, age, for example. And then if you have a large corpus in which none of those things are represented, the corpus is of no interest. You can't control the individual variables within it to get precise and neat groupings that you're interested in. Sometimes, therefore, large volumes of available evidence actually start to vanish into nothing when we look at them. So if you look at something like the long learner corpus, well, it's very large. It's about 10 million words, the version that I have access to. And it has a large number of L1 backgrounds, level of proficiency, target varieties of English and task types in there. But if you're interested in speech, the corpus is of no use at all because it doesn't contain any speech. But actually, if you're interested in variable control and you want to actually combine these variables, Well, that produces something like 3,888 categories from those variables. And actually, the amount of data in any one of those varies between 0 and not a very large amount. So what we want to do with our work is seek to show how learner corpus research might lead to depth and innovation in analysis by looking at issues like speech, looking at issues like discourse and interaction, and then also trying to think about how we better do variable control with the data that we have. So I've said the engagement with discourse has been fleeting and shallow. Actually, I think that's more broadly true in some ways across linguistics, in that there's something of a descriptive black hole in our understanding of interaction. So there's a lot of accounts of discourse and interaction at the level of the term, for example, or you might think about pairs of terms, adjacency pairs, things like that. But what about larger functional units, such as presentation, for example? What's the, if you like, discourse grammar of that? And you might say, well, I might have presentations or I might have narratives, but are there interstitial units, so to speak, units between the level of the term and the level of these big microstructures like narratives or presentations? So a way to think about it, if you want to draw an analogy with the sentence, is you might be able to say, well, there's sentence grammar, there's actually morphosyntax as well around the individual words, but does something come between? And actually with the sentence or the utterance, we know the answer is yes. We have phrases and clauses creating that structure in between. But what happens in speech? What is the structure in between, say, a turn and these large macro structures, the narrative? So some of the work we've been doing in terms of thinking about discourse is to think about these intermediate structures that might be functionally meaningful. We want things which are functionally meaningful. And when it comes back to learner corpora, so tying this slide with the previous one, we think that it's helpful in terms of understanding assessment and materials design. So if there are these meaningful units, surely we want to take those into account when we're analyzing our data, when we're assessing learner performance, and say, for example, when we're developing materials for learners. So on the one hand, we think, well, with learner corpora, there's very little done on discourse and interaction. On the other hand, when we try to use some of the tools to look at that data, we think there might be a descriptive problem in terms of these intermediate units that don't really thought about. So little work has been done. So in terms of developing these intermediate units, we've been working with Doug Biber, Jesse Egbert at Northern Arizona University, and some work supported by the, Trinity College London, to try to develop a set of these intermediate units which would allow us to look at discourse in all forms of spoken interaction, whether they be L1 or L2. Our goal is to see what lies between the level of the utterance and these large microstructures like narratives, for example. How we did this is we took some initial data, in this case about 5 million words of the spoken BNC 2014, which Agnieszka mentioned in the introduction. That's about 11 million words of spontaneous conversation gathered in homes in the UK. And if you want to read more about the spoken BNC 2014, there's a paper that explains the corpus, how it was built, and what is in it. So it's useful as a corpus because it establishes something of a benchmark for everyday conversational interaction. And through that, and by applying these new annotations I'm about to talk about, we might begin to describe everyday conversational competence, what the L1 speakers do when they put together these functional units, which I've yet to name, in order to construct coherent conversations, which then build into these larger macrostructures like narratives, for example. Okay, so how did we develop this taxonomy of intermediate structures? Well, we had a team of coders, mainly in the UK, but some were at Northern Arizona, and Doug actually, in particular, played an important role in quality control. He'd look at a lot of the coding and say, this doesn't work, this looks wrong, etc. And that was very helpful. So we had double coding done in the UK, checking, and then it went through to Milton, Arizona, and further checking was done at that end. And if you want to read more about the functional units themselves, you can read much more than what I'm about to say to you about them in the paper given at the bottom of the screen. Now, the coders were trained to produce what we called plausible analyses. We found it very difficult to actually say that there was an objectively correct analysis, but we thought that there were indeed plausible analyses. And of course, some of this comes down to the inherent ambiguity in some layers of linguistic interaction. There are different analyses which could be taken away, which probably shows us we're getting close to the borders of pragmatics already, where there are multiple plausible analyses. But plausibility was the goal that we had for the analyses that we produced, as well as consistency over time from individual coders. Our goals were to attempt to identify recognizable shifts in communicative function, to identify speech event boundaries, and also to attempt to determine the primary communicative function for each speech event. So we wanted to find blocks of speech, sometimes co-constructed between speaker and hearer, where we could say that is principally about X. So we also needed to find the boundaries of this unit and then label it. And of course, for that, we needed a set of labels. Later on, I wanted to go on and then look at L2 data and explore the question of whether or not conversational spoken English annotation schemes developed on L1 data was useful for looking at language learner data as well. We will return to that. But to give you an idea of what we've done so far, the BNC spoken baseline is complete. That's the 2014 data. So we've got a characterization of what the speech of L1's conversation interactions of L1 speakers look like. I've also taken the Trinity Lancaster corpus and annotated a subset of that amounting to about 1 million words and covering 6 L1 backgrounds. That's actually complete now, I should say. And if you want to read more about the Trinity Lancaster corpus, here's another paper. And I should say, by the way, all the papers that I've referenced so far and throughout the talk actually are open access, so you can easily go and find them and read them. We've also developed another corpus, however, because there are crucial differences between the BNC and the TLC. The BNC is unconstrained conversational interaction by people in a home setting typically. The TLC is driven by tasks. The TLC is based on the GESE examination, which Trinity College London administers. It's a spoken language interaction test where an examiner, who's an L1 speaker of British English, speaks to an examinee, who's an L2 speaker of British English, and they go through a series of set tasks, mainly dialogic, some with the learner being in the lead, some with the examiner being in the lead. But they are set tasks. That's different, of course, from the BNC, which isn't based on set tasks. So what we've also done is get native speakers to sit the GESE exam so that we can factor out anything that we see in the comparisons that we make, which are actually due to the tasks themselves rather than the nature of spoken interaction. And again, that's complete. So a key question for an analysis like this is, does the annotation better structure our data and enhance our understanding of discourse? If it doesn't, well, if that's our goal, then the annotation was a total waste of time. So you can now prepare yourself for the thrilling prospect of discovering in the next 30 or 40 minutes whether I'm giving you a talk about how I wasted my time or whether I found some things out. But let's go back to the background and look at some of the data. So I want to show you how we do the discourse unit annotation and what some of the BNC files look like. You can see an example there on the screen of what it looks like. But basically what we're doing in this spoken data, which is orthographically transcribed, is we're looking for chunks of interaction which have a coherent communicative purpose, a main function, plus possibly subsidiary, secondary, and tertiary functions. It's recognizably self-contained. So, for example, when we're doing the tests between two coders doing the same file, they largely come up with the same chunks of data and say, this seems coherent. And we found over time that typically these things tend to be about 5 utterances or about 100 words in length. So they seem to chunk at that level, and that was sort of discovered empirically. So what type of functions do we believe that we have in data like this? Well, we boiled it down to about 9. How we did this was by going in and slowly working out a coding scheme. First of all, we do the chunking. Then we try and look at the chunks and say, what are these chunks actually about? And the codes that we came up with are as follows. First of all, situation-dependent commentary. You can read about what one of those is on the screen there. Sometimes it's just joking around. Communication with the primary purpose of amusing people, as opposed to, say, situation-dependent commentary, where it's about talking about an activity as it's being done. Also, sometimes we have people engaging in conflict, disagreeing, debating, arguing, or quarreling. We also have giving advice and instructions, talking about the past, talking about the future, just descriptive, time-neutral descriptions, sharing feelings and opinions, and figuring things out, which tends to be collaborative, where you've got two people, I don't know, maybe trying to set something up or work through a problem that they're talking about. So, for example, you may find that you have something which is primarily FTO, figuring things out, but in there, somebody's using some light-hearted remarks in order to introduce some, reduce the social friction of what could be a difficult situation. So there we'd code it and say that joking was the primary function, figuring things out was the primary function, and joking was a secondary function. So we get an idea of what it's mainly about, and if appropriate, we get some secondary and tertiary functions noted in the data also. So completing that allows me to say, well, we have the idea, looking at spoken interaction with learners. Seems to be a dearth of work on that, certainly, which isn't driven by Lexis, things like discourse particles, for example. We have the data, we have some L1 data, we have L1 data in the same tasks as the L2 speakers, we have L2 data, good range of backgrounds, good control of the variables that we can get. And we've introduced a new form of annotation, which allows us to look at the organization of discourse, and these are the categories, and we introduce those categories with primary and, if appropriate, secondary and or tertiary functions shown there as well. So that sort of covers off the data we need and also the linguistic description that we need to develop. Just to go through what the coding process looked like, people would open the data, review the metadata, identify where new discourse begins. So first of all, chunk the data out, put in XML to allow them to do it, one or more communicative functions, one of which would be primary, and then secondary and tertiary, noting those just with a simple numeric scale. Of course, the implication is that the other functions that aren't there all have a value of 0, but rather than just note that, it's implied by not noting it at all. And close it off. It's a very simple process, rather labor intensive because there's a lot of reading to do for this, but in principle, technically, quite simple. Okay. We also do mark out non-discourse units, which you can get. So, for example, you might just get lots of back-channeling, something like that. We'd usually mark that out as non-discourse units. So there you go. You can see here that we have this DU code, which is showing you in XML that we have here a whole discourse unit. We have the opening tag there. We have the ranking of the discourse functions. This is primarily past, with feelings as a secondary function. and we can close it off by adding a closing tag. Okay. So we can spot intermediate structures. Now, those intermediate structures can then be labeled. That labeling seems to work quite well. Certainly in terms of L1 data, we've applied the labeling and we're starting to produce insights on the basis of that. I've also labeled the L2 corpora now. It works just as well for them. But what does this buy us? Do we actually get insights into how they combine together or what they do, for example? Okay, so let's think about this a little more carefully. So rather than assume the communicative functions in the BNC are these, we want to ask the question of how do these combine to produce major communicative functions in the discourse units of the spoken BNC? How do we actually achieve that? Well, frequent patterns of co-occurring linguistic features tend to suggest an underlying communicative function. So rather than just saying we know the functions because we have all these labels there, we might want to ask ourselves the question, can we use something like the work of Doug Biber, the multidimensional approach, in order to look at how these lexicogrammatical features that you're able to look at using his approach combine together in order to produce functions. So could we take a sort of more data-driven approach to it, and that would give us additional insight. The multidimensional analysis approach, of course, uses something like 70 features. Now, in the spoken BNC, so far we've annotated something like 25,500 discourse units. And the average length of a discourse unit is 128 words long. Now, this really stops us trying to use traditional MDA. Why is that? Well, I've given you some notes there, but the very simple fact of the matter is this. Traditional MDA relies on frequency data derived from the corpora in order to carry out factorings. That frequency data becomes increasingly unreliable the shorter the unit that you have from which you derive the frequency data. So Biber estimated originally that you need units of around 1,000 words in length in order to get out reliable estimates of frequency to actually get his technique to work. Perfectly reasonable thing to claim. However, all of our units are 128 words long. Why is this an issue? Well, say, for example, in one of those units, you've got 128 words of data. You see somebody talking to somebody called Alison, and they say the word Alison 3 times. Now, if you're to normalize that to per 1,000 words, which I sort of compare it to that type of length of things, then you're going to get something like 27 mentions per 1,000 words of the word Alison. Well, that actually makes that word much more frequent than it is in language in general. So 128 words inflates, if you like, the frequency of words that you happen to see. And it makes it very hard to distinguish between words which are just inherently infrequent but happen to have occurred, and words which actually aren't inherently infrequent. So the use of MDA to allow us to do a sort of more, if you like, data-up or bottom-up approach to the analysis is actually confounded by the relatively short length of the discourse units. So another approach we've taken to the analysis of the data is something called MCA. Now, MCA is actually very similar to MDA. It does pretty much the same thing, but instead of relying on frequency, it relies simply on patterns of presence and absence across the data. So instead of actually wanting to say, for example, the word Alison occurs 3 times in 128 words, you simply say the word Alison exists in this data and leave it at that. And then you're actually doing the mathsy bit that follows, on the basis of patterns of presence and absence, as opposed to patterns of relative frequency. So that's how you get around this problem with little data. And if you want to read much more about that approach, you can read this paper here. Once again, it's open access. So it's a very useful technique for looking at short units. You can even run it down to the level of individual terms, which we have actually done with the Trinity data. So it's just taking that idea of linguistic co-occurrence, but running it in terms of presence and absence. You're looking for words which actually, or features which co-occur. You're not interested in how frequently the individual items occur at all. And that allows you to get around this problem that MDA would have. So where have we got to in the talk now? Okay, we've established that we want to do work on discourse in learner language. We've established that's rare. We've gone through the difficult process of building a large data set to look at discourse in learner language. We built two other data sets, or extracted two other data sets, the BNC L1 interactions and also the TLC L1 interactions, where we get native speaker L1 speakers to take the Trinity exam so we can factor out issues of task. We've identified a descriptive black hole, this level of the intermediate discourse unit. We've done the work to go away and actually describe what these discourse units are, annotate the data, verify the quality of that annotation. Then we've thought about doing a bottom-up approach to looking at the data as well. We discovered that we can't use a good standard approach, MDA, because of the short nature of the discourse units. And we've developed a different approach, MCA, which in some ways is very similar to MDA, but instead of using word frequency and relative word frequency in order to look for patterns of co-occurrence and avoidance, it uses presence and absence instead to look for patterns of word co-occurrence and avoidance. So let's look as an example at MCA on the terms of the spoken BNC. So we do MCA on the terms of the discourse units. We can look then and say, well, the codes assigned to the discourse units can be extended to the terms. So, for example, if I've got a discourse unit which is principally FTO, we make the simplifying assumption that every turn in there we can also code as FTO because they're building up to this major unit. So we can compare MCA with the discourse unit annotation. So we can do things like this. We can say, for example, that this discourse unit here, 3, 2, situation dependent commentary 3, FEL2, which we get from there. That's what the discourse unit is. And then we can say for each of those utterances here, which are listed here, we just give them the same value. That's a simplifying assumption, but it's a satisfying one, at least for the experiment that we want to carry out. Now, the dimension coordinates are assigned to each turn. They then interrelate with the codes. Now, the dimension coordinates are something that I need to talk about because they can be terrifically confusing to people. When we do MCA, what happens is it looks at these clusters of occurrence and avoidance in terms of the features that we're looking at, and it then arranges things into pairs on so-called dimensions. So in other words, think of it just in terms of pairs of clusters. The first dimension says, I have a cluster of files here which exhibit one behavior and a cluster of files there which exhibit another. Mathematically, those clusters are given values on this thing called a dimension. The center of the dimension is 0. Either side, you move to the positive and the negative, and those things are placed, those clusters are placed on the positive and the negative sides. Note that the words positive and negative here are not evaluative. We're not saying they're bad and good or good and bad. They're simply different. And that's what helps us break these apart. Our analysis goes down dimension by dimension, looking at the clusters, making sense of what makes these things similar and moving on until you come to a pair where you can say, I can see that they're clustered mathematically, but as a linguist, there's no particular pattern I can see there. And then we stop. And that's how we work out how many dimensions are there, and they come in these pairs. Okay. So what happens when we look at MCA on the BNC terms? We can take this technique, as I said before, down to very short lengths indeed. In this case, we're looking at the BNC terms. So we're trying to take these terms, which have inherited the codes, remember, from the discourse units, and look whether there's some type of relationship between them. So all in all, we found 7 interpretable dimensions using the MCA technique on the BNC data. And here, in each case, after the dimension, I tell you what the relationship is between the 2 halves of the dimension. So these are the pairs that we're analyzing. So dimension 1 in an MCA analysis, in my experience, usually relates to length. If length varies greatly across the data, you'll find dimension 1 will usually pick it up. So if you like to think about it, you have short turns and long turns. And the long turns in this case usually are elaborated narratives versus minimal responses. So people saying things like, yeah, very short responses, as opposed to long terms, which when you look at them tend to be elaborated narratives. I'll just do the dimensions and then I'll come back and look at the discourse units. Dimension 2 tends to be on one side, interactive information exchange, and on the other side, attitudinal descriptions. 3, epistemic stance versus informational recounts. 4, revealing, looking into the future, versus information seeking, typically with a past orientation. Dimension 5, narrative versus non-narrative terms. Dimension 6, opinionated narrative, so narrative with a dash of opinionated evaluation, versus simply situation-dependent commentary, talking about the here and now. And dimension 7, which was advisory versus personal narrative. So that, if you like, in 7 dimensions, 14 classifications, seems to be how the BNC terms organize themselves. This, if you like, in a nutshell, is a description of the functional nature of interactive conversation in the home, as we can see in the BNC. Now, because we got the terms also to inherit, if you like, the functions from the discourse units, we can start to compare what we see with one view, the bottom up, if you like, the MCA approach to the data, with the discourse unit, the top down, where the analyst goes in and applies a label to a sequence of terms. So we can see the elaborated narratives, for example, are associated with the discourse units of past and feelings. That makes a lot of sense. And minimal responses tend to be negative in the negative side of the dimension, and the minimum responses tend to be associated with situation-dependent commentary. So people saying things like, so do you think I need to put this down here? Yeah. So that, yeah, is an example of a situation-dependent commentary contribution, which is a minimal response. Dimension 2, interactive information exchange. Well, we find the figuring things out function there. And again, that makes sense. Versus attitudinal descriptions. Well, we find description and feelings there, which actually sound like a good summary of attitudinal descriptions. Dimension 3, epistemic stance versus informational recounts, information, past, they're talking about information from the past, epistemic stance, a strong focus on feelings. Revealing the future versus information seeking, revealing the future, well, we have the future function and the feeling function there. That makes sense. Information seeking from the past, figuring things out, and past functions there. Again, makes sense. Narrative versus non-narrative. Narrative, well, that's no surprise to see past come up, because a sequence of events through time is the core of a narrative. Versus non-narrative, what are the non-narrative things that tend to be discussed in opposition to this? Situation-dependent commentaries and figuring things out. That makes sense. Opinionated narrative versus situation-dependent commentary. Well, this is past plus feelings, which distinguishes it apart from that. Situation-dependent commentary. Well, yes, we've got some of the same things here as the non-narrative, the situation-dependent commentary and the figuring things out, but we also have a future orientation. People are talking about the future also, figuring things out in the future, so irrealist type reasoning. And then advisory versus personal narrative. Advisory drawing on the functions of future, advice, and description, and the personal narrative, again, narrative focused in the past. So what did this show us? Well, this showed us that actually taking two views of the data, which were broadly compatible, a bottom-up view with the MCA and the top-down view with the discourse unit annotation, actually came to similar views of the data. This, if you like, was sort of mutually reinforcing or corroborative views of the data. We didn't come across anything there that convinced us that our categories, our top-down categories, were wrong, nor did we come across anything that convinced us that our bottom-up descriptions of the data through the MCA made no sense. So this was a nice exercise in terms of mutual verification. There are no clashes between these two complementary views of the data. Both characterize spoken interaction in English, conversational interaction in the home in this case, in very similar ways. So what happens then when we do an MCA of the Trinity-Lancaster corpus discourse units? Well, we get very similar groupings out of it. We get 5 dimensions, and this is what we find. Now, there are differences, of course, compared to everyday conversation in the home, as we would expect there to be, because language is functionally driven. The functions here are being selected by a series of tasks, unlike in the home, where they're not actually sitting in exam composed of a series of tasks. So we should expect to see diversity between what's happening in conversational spoken English in the home and what's happening in the context of an exam in which there are a limited number of tasks. But nonetheless, we can get good descriptions out of the data as to what we're seeing. We can characterize spoken interaction in the exam in the same way as we could characterize it in the interactions in the home that we had in the BNC, in this case, using the MCA approach. And we can have some faith in that, because when we looked at that with the L1 data, we saw a higher degree of congruence between the MCA results and the discourse unit results. So in terms of what's similar to everyday conversations in the home between L1 speakers, the long-short distinction is there. That just makes a lot of sense. It's an easy way to organize the data. And as I say in these results, it's often the strongest signal you get up. It's usually the first dimension out. It says there are some long tones and there are some short tones. This also is repeated. Language is descriptive and effective versus informative and instructive. Narratives seem to be important too in the context of these examinations, so the L2 English in these examinations, as they were in the L1 data. Seeking and encoding stance is another category that's shared between the L2 and the L1 data, as is information seeking in the past. So here, if you like, we have a small snapshot of L1 conversational English, L2 conversational English, admittedly in the context of an exam, but those snapshots actually have a lot in common. There is a lot of overlap in terms of the functional categories that we can derive from the data using this bottom-up approach. To give you an idea of what some of the long and short discourse units look like, just to go through the L2 examples. Those are typically short discourse units, but sometimes you get very long descriptions, which generate a longer than usual discourse unit where you can't actually find a break in it. And this one is principally a descriptive discourse unit with a side order, if you like, of feeling. Dimension 2, we see descriptive and effective versus negative. This is a good slide to show you because so far I've been talking about MCA in very abstract terms. I haven't described to you the features that we use. The features that we use to drive the MCA along are very similar to the Biber features. And here you get an idea of the features which come together in order to actually produce dimension 2, that's descriptive and effective, versus the informative and instructive. So we're looking at a series of morphosyntactic features typically, which we think help to characterize the conversations, and these are based on the Biber features for MDA. So again, that just emphasizes the message that the MCA and the MDA approach are very closely linked. So these are the linguistic features that we see coming together in order to form this side of the dimension. These are the linguistic features that form that side of the dimension. Okay. Gives you an idea of some of the terms there, which are descriptive and effective. A discourse unit that is descriptive and effective. Okay, so it's full of descriptions of the learner's country, of residence, traditions, and functions. On the informative and instructive side, here's a discourse unit that shows you that happening. This particular discourse unit informs the upcoming task and provides instructions about what the learner needs to do. And of course, this is a very good example of how informative and instructive in the context of an exam differs functionally in some ways from what you'd find in a home. In this case, the focus of the instruction always seems to gravitate around the tasks in the exam, whereas if you're looking at informative and instructive in the home, while you might say it's the same function, we typically don't give one another exam instructions in a conversation. We're talking about other things instead, but overall the function's the same, but the particular focuses of it, of course, may vary. Okay. So are these things useful in terms of looking at assessment? Did they really mean very much? Well, actually, yes, seems to be the answer. If we look here at the conversation task within the Trinity-Lancaster corpus, and the Trinity-Lancaster corpus has, as I've said, a range of these interactive tasks in it. The conversation task is one in which there's supposed to be a sustained conversation between the examiner and the student, and they have to keep it going. In this case, you can see that students who get the highest grade, A, tend to use more discourse units from the positive, descriptive, and effective side of the dimension, whereas the students who get D, if you like, they're placed much more decisively into the informative and instructive. When we actually look at that, the answer to it becomes very clear indeed. And I've given you a hint to explain it already, in that these are students who often have to have the exam explained to them more than once. Sometimes they're stopped and reminded what the purpose of the exam is. So that sort of informative and instructive language focused on the process of the task comes up more frequently for the weaker students. And that's what pulls their conversation, if you like, off towards that side of the dimension. So we get a nice insight there into why this particular function is used more with those students. Oops, sorry, I've managed to zip forward several slides. Okay. Next, let's have a look at the discourse units in the conversation and task according to multiple features. Of course, I was talking earlier on about variable control and how we actually want to combine variables in order to make insights. Nice thing about the TLC is across the range of variables that are in there, the corpus is balanced. So you can combine the variables together and not come up with empty boxes. That's one of the problems with the Lomond corpus, for example. If you look at some of those combinations of features, you end up with no data. That's not the case necessarily for the TLC. And here I'm able to combine together, show you here, the task, conversation, with the grade the students achieved, the level that they're supposed to be at in terms of the CFR, and the grade of examination that they're taking. So if we look, say, for example, at grade 6 learners, B1, grade 6 learners in the conversation task, they're more associated with the informative and instruction function regardless of mark. So if we look at grade 6, informative and instructive, look at grade 6 again here, informative and instructive, here, informative and instructive, and here, informative and instructive. So there's a progression here. As the students move on to level 7 and 8, the higher grades of exam, they move away from this to that. And of course, we understand the reason why. Their proficiency is improving, and when we look at the data, we find that they need less instruction about the task, less reminder about the task, and therefore the shift away to the descriptive and effective from the informative and instructive. Okay. Looking at the discussion task then. Similar to conversation tasks, it's interactive, but in this case, the student's given a topic to discuss with the examiner, and they have to discuss that. So, what do you think about the recent election or something like that? Or do you agree with Foxington? That type of question. Okay, what do we see there? Once again, we're combining task, mark, CFR grade, grade of examination. What do we see? Well, learners in B1 grade 6 across all marks communicate in fewer discourses units associated with the informative and instructive function than learners in the higher proficiency and grade levels. So once again, grade 6 here, grade 6 here, and grade 6 here. We're seeing that difference, but note here that we've got more progression with the students rated A at grade 6. They've already started to make this transition, if you like, to this side of the dimension from that. So the lower rated students at grade 6 draw more on that side of the dimension than the higher rated students at 7 and 8, or the highest rated of the higher grade students at 7 and 8, or the highest rated students at grade 6. So we can start to see these predictive patterns of variables, how they shift the data around, and how they make us think about the data in terms of progression, in terms of score and grade in both of these cases. Okay, the interactive task is one which is taken by students also at higher levels. They don't do that at grade 6. The interactive task is where they once again have a discussion. Regardless of grade and proficiency, the interactive task invites discourse units that are more associated with the instructive and informative function. Now, this could look like it's a task-related item, but in fact, think about the difference that we're looking at here. There are no grade 6 students, and typically they're the ones that needed the instructive and informative. So it makes perfect sense that in this task, at level 7 and 8, we're not seeing instructive and informative. We didn't really see that with the other tasks. So what we're actually seeing here is that this particular task also follows that behavior. So for all 3 tasks, we're seeing that there is a progression between the grades, with those grade 6 students being the ones who draw most heavily on the instructive and informative task for the reasons outlined. Okay, I'm going to start to conclude now because we've been on a long journey. We started off with the argument that we need to look more at discourse, the interaction nature of spoken, the interactive nature of speech, and look at learner language in that context. We thought about how we need data sets which allow us to combine variables so we can get insights into how those variables operate together. We looked at how there was a need to identify intermediate units of discourse, which would allow us to get some type of helpful angle on how communicative interaction works. We talked about how we needed to generate the data sets for us to be able to talk about L1 discourse with reference to a set of tasks, and L2 discourse with reference to a set of tasks, so that we can combine and compare those. I haven't looked at the L1 task limited data today, but there is a limited time, so I apologize for that. Then we thought about the discourse unit system that we needed to create, did that. Then we thought about verifying that to see if we could do a bottom-up version of it. We couldn't do MDA, so we did MCA instead. We ran the MCA on the data from the L1 speakers in conversation, compared the discourse unit annotation and its outcomes functionally with the MCA annotation, found a higher degree of convergence and coherence. So then we look at the L2 data with some certainty that the MCA is going to show us something that we want to look at and that we can believe in terms of discourse description at that intermediate level. We get out those 5 dimensions. We look at those 5 dimensions in terms of close reading of the text to make sure that we understand what they are and what they're doing. We then start to look at the data itself, combining variables, and we see that the combinations of the variables give us useful insight, principally in terms of progression through grades. 6, very different from 7 and 8. We looked at 1 dimension only, but 6, very different from 7 and 8. And that's consistent across the tasks. And then at grade 6, we see a difference in terms of the grades the students were assigned. In one task, they're still over on one side of the dimension. In another task, the very best students are transitioning over away from the instructive and towards the effective. So we got those views of the data. Okay. So we find that a form to function relationship at term level, the discourse unit level, worked. We could find it. And this corresponds with other functional codes assigned to the discourse units by the coder. So that bottom-up, top-down analysis, mutual verification of results or corroboration of results was helpful. We can get more dimensions, of course, if we want to look at terms. We also actually find less strong association to the discourse units assigned by the other coders. There's more noise. The less data you use, the more noise you find typically. But when we complete our analysis at the discourse unit level, we identify fewer communicative functions, and these communicative functions are much more strongly correlated with communicative codes assigned by the other coders. So the further away or the less data we have, of course, the more there is noise, the more there's less data there, the more there's interpretation. But the discourse unit level I've been showing you today is a helpful way of looking at things. It seems relatively stable and insightful. So I'd say that the approach that we've taken, both in terms of discourse unit annotations and the MCA, greatly enhances our understanding of the structuring of discourse, and that's helpful for a host of purposes. We find that the discourse units relate to task and function. I think I showed you that when we went through the MCA of the BNC and then matched it against the discourse unit codes. Those discourse unit codes, those functions, were relating fairly clearly and logically through to the MCA-derived groupings. We've also seen in looking at the L2 data that you could almost claim that discourse units are diagnostic of performance in certain circumstances. Some of the tasks we looked at, we got strong indications that in dimension 3, for example, if students were drawing heavily or the discourse units were heavily being placed over onto the side of the dimension which focused on advice, this was probably assigned either to a lower grade student in terms of exam, or if it's a grade 6, the more that the discourse units are being placed over on that side of the dimension, the higher the likelihood that the student was given a lower mark. So you could say that certain discourse units would be important to focus on for pedagogical, diagnostic, or feedback purposes. So if somebody said to me, I have a student going in to take that Trinity exam at grade 6, what would be a good piece of advice that I could give them in order for them to improve their mark? I'd say, listen to the advice of the examiner and understand it. Because all the evidence suggests that if you don't, and you start the task, and the task then has to be repaired by an examiner giving you advice, for example, all the data seems to be shouting that this will actually reduce your mark. So actually you get insights to teachers from analyses like this as well. The work we're doing at the moment is looking at whether the patterns I've just shown you vary by L1 background. So is it true for all backgrounds? You just do see some variation by L1 backgrounds in the data sometimes. And also we're looking at the comparison to the L1 Trinity data where British English speakers have taken the exam to see whether we get insights there. I have a few comments to make on that if anyone would like to ask a question about it. And of course, we also may be able to look at some point at L1 interference or some combination of these. So where we do find differences, for example, in L1 background, when we see L2 speakers producing slightly different performances with reference to discourse units, the question arises, is this something to do with the way they're being taught, or is it something to do with how these discourse units work in their own language? And at the moment, I'm working closely with a Chinese student, and we're looking at Chinese speakers, we're looking at a corpus of conversational Chinese to see whether or not a discourse unit approach to Chinese can give us some insights into how Chinese learners then go on to use English. In other words, do the discourse units of Chinese transfer over into the L2 English and produce a slightly different version of discourse than would otherwise be produced. Okay, and if you want to find out much more about this work in much greater depth, then next year, or probably just the year after, this book should come out, Learn a Language, Discourse and Interaction, a corpus-based analysis of spoken English, which I'm doing together with Izzy and Gavin, and that will give you much, much more of the results of the type of analysis I've talked about today. But I hope at least I've convinced you that spending the time to develop the corpora, spending the time to develop the functional annotations, spending the time to develop or work with MCA has allowed me to get some interesting insights into learner data, which can be useful for a wide range of users, from the learner to the teacher, the materials developer. Thank you very much.